Fighting over land claims. The map shows that both France and Britain claimed the Ohio Valley area and other land to the south as part of their Native American colonies. Fighting over land claims. The map shows that both France and Britain claimed the Ohio Valley area and other land to the south as part of their North American colonies. The land at that time was occupied primarily by different Native Americans, such as the Shawnee and the Miami. The Ohio Valley area became a huge problem for France and Britain, and their rivalry created problems for the Native Americans. The French and Indian War. The problem was that both France and Britain claimed the same land for colonies. France and Britain would not accommodate or tolerate each other's claims, and neither side would move out of the Ohio Valley area. They decided to solve their problem by fighting a war, a form of dominating. The British called that war the French and Indian War. France and Britain had fought some earlier wars over the Ohio Valley area, but those wars did not solve their land claim problems. The French and Indian War, which began in 1754, was the most important war because Britain won, and in 1763, France was forced to give up most of its colonies in North America. Four factors of group success as they apply to war. The same four factors of group success, capability, leadership, resources, and motivation, that explain the success of the early explorers also helps explain why Britain won the French and Indian War. In any war, one factor may take on a more important role than another, but all the factors together will help determine the winner and the loser. Looking at these factors at the beginning of a war will not always let you predict who will win because these factors can constantly change during a war. Take a look at figure 5.3, which is on this slide. It describes the four factors as they apply to war. The definitions of the four factors of group success are slightly changed when talking about war. Capability has to do with which side has the best weapons and which side has the best trained soldiers and sailors. Leadership has to do with strategy, how well military leaders can plan for battles, and how well leaders can get their men to do what they want. Resources has to do with the size of the armies and navies or the amount of money, materials, and supplies each country can use in a war. Motivation has to do with each army's and country's desire to succeed. France and Britain each had advantages and disadvantages during the French and Indian War. The advantages and disadvantages for the four factors are described below for the beginning of the French and Indian War. So at the beginning of the war, capability. At the beginning of the French and Indian War, neither the French nor the British had an advantage in capability. The quality and the training of British Army was comparable to that of the French Army. The quality and the training of both countries' navies were also the same. Furthermore, neither side had superior weapons, so there was no advantage in capability. Neither France nor Britain had the overall advantage in capability at the beginning of the French and Indian War. Weapons, armies, and navies were the same for both the French and the British. Leadership. France. The French had an advantage in leadership at the beginning of the French and Indian War because they had only one large country in North America. A single government ruled the French colony, and it could make war decisions for the entire French colonial area. Besides having unified leadership at the colonial government level, the French had better military leadership. The generals in the French army had better plans and were better trained to fight in the wilderness of North America than were the British generals. Britain. The British had no advantage over France in leadership at the beginning of the French and Indian War. The colonial governments of the 13 colonies did not work together or with the British government in helping to fight the French or make war decisions. Because the colonial governments did not want to work together, they failed to provide the leadership needed to fight the French. Resources. France. The French had an advantage in resources because they sent a larger army to fight in North America than the British did. France's advantages were also increased because most of the Native Americans in Canada became allies with the French army. Allies are two countries or groups that agree to help each other. With their Native American allies, the French army was much larger than the British army. Also, the French government was willing to spend a great deal of money on military supplies at the beginning of the French and Indian War. The Spain also became allies with France and gave them money to help them in the war as well. France did have a disadvantage, though, because few French colonists were farmers. That meant the amount of food available to the French army was limited. The French army had to import much of its food from France. Britain, however, had many British colonists who were farmers. Their slight advantage was that they were able to get food to troops more easily, and their troops were better fed. The main disadvantage that Britain had in resources at the beginning of the French and Indian War was getting enough colonists to join the British army. Many colonists thought of themselves as farmers, not soldiers. They did not want to become soldiers. Although the British colonial population was approximately 20 times larger than France's colonial population, most British colonists did not join the British army to fight the French. British war leaders failed to send extra troops to make up the difference between the size of the bigger French army and the smaller British army. French advantage in resources. France had the overall advantage in resources at the beginning of the French and in the beginning of the French and Indian War. Both the British government and the French government were willing to spend money on the French and Indian War. The British had a slight advantage in getting food for its troops at the beginning of the French and Indian War because the British army could get food from their colonies rather than having to import it. The major advantage went to France because they sent a larger army to fight in North America than did Britain. Motivation. No advantage in motivation. Neither France nor Britain had the overall advantage in motivation at the beginning of the French and Indian War. Both the British and the French governments were motivated to keep their colonies. Economically, both countries had much to lose if they did not keep their North American colonies. Therefore, neither side had an advantage in motivation at the beginning of the French and Indian War. A summary. A summary of the four factors at the beginning of the French and Indian War. The four factors at the beginning of the French and Indian War predicted a French victory. In capability, neither France nor Britain had an overall advantage at the beginning of the French and Indian War. Weapons, armies, and navies were the same for both the French and the British. In leadership, France had the advantage because their colony had a unified colonial government to make war decisions and better generals. In resources, France had the advantage because they sent a larger army to fight in North America than Britain did. In motivation, neither side had an advantage. Both France and Britain wanted to keep their colonies. Fighting the French and Indian War. At the beginning of the French and Indian War in 1754, it appeared that the French were going to win. The war was going poorly for the British. The British decision to fight over the Ohio Valley area in North America looked like a poor choice because they were losing most of the battles. They lost a major battle in 1755 at the current site of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. At the battle, the commanding British general, William Braddock, was killed, and an officer of the Virginia militia, somebody you might have heard of, a guy named George Washington, helped the British to regroup. Washington became famous because of the skill and courage he showed at that battle. Two of the four factors change in favor of Britain. In 1756, two of the four factors of group success changed significantly to Britain's advantage. The first factor to change was leadership. That change happened